Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing quite well, thank you.
Good.
We're going to start off today with a sad story. Hopefully we can call attention to a problem that people might be motivated to help. But we want to talk about a story we read just last week of a girl, 8 years old, that was doing school, remotely, and she was in the middle of class and she was having a problem, and it turned out that the girl was very, very disturbed, and when she was asked to describe what the problem turned out that she flat out admitted in tears that she was hungry and had no food to eat. And that's just a tragic story, but when you look into it, it becomes more tragic because it's an incident that is preventable. It's man-made problem here. So we looked into that, but then we got to talking about this. She's a victim, and we're going to talk about why she's a victim of the lockdown and all the nonsense going on with the virus and this sort of thing. So that's what we want to talk about. And how many people are invisible up until that moment when people described her. Now I think people want to help her, but she was an invisible person. How many others are there? And I started making a list. I thought, well, I'll find 6 or 7 examples to make this point that the real damage done by lockdown, there's been people talking about it, but that isn't what's generally on the mainstream media. They're talking about the people who might suggest that they should obey the government in a lockdown and make sure you're 6 or 8 feet apart and wearing your mask and all that stuff. That's what you hear about. But when I started the list, I figured, maybe we'll get 6 people or six incidences that we can talk about. But you know what? We can't go over what I ended up doing. Look, I have 2 pages written of different things that I think is a consequence of people suffering, from the lockdown. Of course, we have been talking about that from the very beginning because it was the furthest thing from a libertarian answer to a significant health problem. A lot of times the more complicated and more serious a problem is, the more freedom you need to get more opinions and more choices. But when it gets narrowed down to a few people or a government to solve all the problems and analyze everything going on, that is bad. And when it gets down to about 2 people, politicians and bureaucrats making all the decisions, we shouldn't expect things to be solved easily. The more complicated the problem, the more freedom you need. And in this case, looking at lockdown, the more complicated it got, the more government we had. And guess what else they did? Spent more money too. Ironically, that never helps either because eventually somebody has to pay, and sometimes it's the very victims that they're trying to help end up paying for this. So this is a story that did spread around, probably not enough, but it's interesting that the individual that came to her rescue is an interesting person to talk to as well.
Yeah, she was the former New Jersey lieutenant governor, and she was also a gubernatorial candidate for governor in New Jersey, and she's the one who relayed the story because she now runs a food bank, and this case came across her, so she told the story, and it's a very touching story, and we use it not because it's a singular story, but because we believe it's endemic to what's happened in the lockdowns. But locking down societies on this scale over a virus really is unprecedented. It hasn't been done. There have been sort of minor lockdowns and quarantines of sick people, of course, in the past, but locking down and quarantining healthy people is unprecedented. Even Fauci, who's now the king of lockdowns until he changes his mind, of course, and says he was always against them. But even he, and we talked about this the other day, back in 2014 when Ebola was going around, and it's a pretty nasty disease, right? He said it's draconian to think that you can quarantine Ebola victims. And even at the beginning of the flu, when it broke out in Wuhan, China, he said about lockdowns, that's something I don't think we could possibly do in the United States. And in the same interview, he later on said, historically, when you shut things down, it just doesn't have a major effect. Okay, he changed his mind. But one effect that it does have And I thought we'd go into the heavy stuff first because this is a little bit difficult to see. But let's look at that first clip that I sent over on the second clip actually, and then we'll move into the tweet. But here's the COVID-19. Parents who lost teenagers to suicide in lockdown issue warning. There's going to be a lot of PTSD. And this is coming out more and more young people. And in fact, let's go to that tweet for a second. And I hesitated to do this, and the person who made this Twitter feed hesitated to do it. But let's put up that first tweet. I hesitate posting this as the harsh reality and one that's whispered about, but never really put front and center. We are a year into this horrible disease. We are making any and all decisions to preserve life from the disease, but we've forgotten about other illnesses. And this is a thread of young people who have committed suicide. They have experienced depression and other things that happen, particularly with young teens when chemicals and things are getting through their bodies and what have you after being locked down. Let's just scroll quickly because we don't want to focus on individual people, but just on the sheer number. And this thread goes on and on and on and on of young people when the descriptions of what happened to them and how they broke down mentally and emotionally and ended up killing themselves as young as 11 years old. It is just heart-wrenching. And in fact, let's stop scrolling because it is too much. But this is just an example to show you these are the invisible victims in that the media doesn't want to talk about them. They don't want to talk about the side effects of what they've done in an unprecedented way and something that even Fauci says is not going to have a big effect. But we need to talk about it because now as COVID is down over 77% over the last few weeks, it's time to start letting the smoke clear and looking at what they've done.
Yes, and I want to talk a little bit more about the medicine, the suicide complication, as well as the medical aspect of dealing with the virus. Let's say that history will suggest strongly that we had a very, very bad flu season, a flu winter, and a lot of people got sick. So you have the combination of sick people, being sick with the flu, which has happened many, many times over the years, and also the way the lockdown has affected medicine. And there's a tremendous amount of interference there. You know, with the lockdown, it affected the way the patients were treated. For instance, the hydroxychloroquine, a drug around for 50 years, is now still being recognized, and some of the people that wanted to prohibit it have changed their minds on this, that it was a decent drug, that doctors knew about it, and the well-versed professors and the experts in government, they disagree with the people who were actually practicing medicine and used it and believed in this drug. So they removed it and made it, you know, in our country, they really couldn't even use it. They made it scarce and expensive, and you were a quack if you used it. That attitude has changed. They rather quietly said, no, they can use it again. At the same time, they wanted you to take the very, very expensive medication and saying the medical treatment has to be the vaccine. So I see these people as victims who have suffered the consequence of interference in medical care, the interference of the doctor and the patient making this decision, and both the people who were sick as well as the people medically suffered from the lockdown. And you've already mentioned the most horrible thought is how many young people ended up committing suicide over this. I mean, this is a medical catastrophe. Doctors are supposed to help people, not devise a system that is just gut-wrenching and creating such a horrible depression. But there were many other ways that the lockdown affected medical care and individual suffering. I know some some personally. A lot of people will know, even people listening to me right now will know of some people that had trouble seeing their doctor in an ordinary sense, in getting medical care. Oh, they say, well, yeah, you could have done it remotely, and they could have done this. But just the intimidation of not going there and talking about things on your computer, people didn't go. That's the fact of the matter. So people missed their cancer diagnosis. They were delayed because they wanted to be checked. The treatments had been delayed and their checkups had been delayed. Due to this tension in here. We had, the drug addiction, the opioid epidemic, much, much worse. And then they came up with this crazy scheme of, well, we have to ration the care.
Yeah.
Politicians are going to ration medical care. Rationing is not a good idea under any economic circumstance because you need the market to distribute services and all when there's scarcity. So they come in and say, essential services. We'll decide who's essential. Just this week, Daniel, in our own county right here, they announced, well, we're opening up that now, elective surgeries can now, you can do up to, maybe, I'm just going to throw the number out, but it's like they increased it from 25% of the requests up to 50% of the time to do elective services, as if people, elective services can be almost anything. Maybe they just want to be a checkup.
Yeah.
I've had a pain and I'd like to get an EKG or something like that. So and even in our very county that we've been trying to help them move along to a better scenario than they have been. But in spite of all this and this epidemic that people are hysterical about, I think the creation of an epidemic that a lot of people suffered from, and they're not even in the medical field, and they are not claiming they're sick, but the results have been that there's a larger number of people now that suffer from the epidemic of lies and distortions, the confusion about science. You got to, the only true science is the ones those people who want to do it. Only Fauci speaks, even if he's changed it every week. So he covers his bases. He do it this way, do it that way. So that is the epidemic that we've turned this into. And it sounds, well, that's not quite as bad as the other. But I tell you what, the epidemic of listening to the people who are going to take care of us, pretty serious problem at the expense of our liberties.
And politics played a huge role in this because there wasn't this massive freak out about hydroxychloroquine until Trump praised it. So if Trump praises it, then of course that's when they forbade it. And even if you talked about it, we've only been able to talk about it on the show recently because we're afraid of getting locked down ourselves. You couldn't even mention the words, and all of a sudden they look back and say, well, maybe we can't. But it was all politics. You can't say that it was the science. And you mentioned elective surgeries. Well, they viewed some cancer surgeries as elective. And that's pretty serious stuff. You got to wait 9 months with an aggressive cancer. It's insane. And last week's big scare story, by the way, Dr. Paul, as you know, was the UK and South Africa variant. And this is what they were pushing to get people, keep the fear pumped up. Well, that 77% decline continues. There hasn't been a bump because of this. But one of the things that we looked at a story yesterday and we wanted to talk a little bit about when you talk about invisible victims, i.e. not paid attention to by the media or by most people, and you mentioned the opioid problem and the overall problem of drug and alcohol abuse. Here's a piece that we saw in Bloomberg about the surge of deaths from opioid. Here is the chart. If you look at from April 2020 on, it was pretty flat from June of 16, and then it took a big sharp increase. Drug overdoses of all kinds killed nearly 84,000 people in the U.S. from August 2019 to July 2020. That's 23% more than in the previous 12-month period, and the highest number of overdose deaths ever recorded in a single year. That was not by accident, for sure.
There was a problem in Afghanistan in 1980, and Carter was the president. And the Russians went into Afghanistan, the Soviets, and he had to react. And the Olympics were coming up, so he had them boycott the Olympics. Americans couldn't go. It made me sick because, we'll take care of that. And the way Congress took care of the stupidity of this was to invite the people who didn't get to go, trained a lifetime for this, didn't get to go, so they got over there and we appropriated money to buy gold medals for them all. And I thought that was so disgusting. But a little bit of that is going on now. Think of the sporting events that have been canceled. They've been training. Some of them are seniors in high school, seniors in college. They missed their best year, and nobody go, well, that's just a sport. We're doing serious stuff. They can play their sports later later on and all. And what if the lockdown isn't doing any good?
Yeah.
You know, and that's the big thing. This is done in spite of the fact that they have no evidence of the lockdown really saving lives.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it's being contradicted all the time. And when you add up a lot of this and other things, it looks like it accelerated the deaths. But it's all done by mandates and dictates. They have one, you stay in your house. Well, it was worse staying in your house than going for a walk in the park. They go for a walk on a beach and they feel so guilty about what their neighbors might think, so they wear masks when they're walking in the mountains and on the beach. And then we have people who, and governors in particular, say, well, okay, we got to take on, these are elderly people, we got to have them in their nursing home and mandate it, write legislation, say you must take them, put them into the nursing home. So this is the kind of thing that just adds so much trouble. What about the people in entertainment? You know, I would think there's some people that actually enjoy entertainment and there's a medical benefit to it, to go out and relax, you know, and have an entertainment. But no, that's under prohibition, still is. And and they claim that the solution is you take a stadium with 100,000 people and say, the gods have just said that it's 25%.
Yeah.
And that'll save lives and you can have your fun and we'll do it under these circumstances. And all it does is cause more harm and anxiety and hatred and more disgust from the government. And right now I think that disgust is growing because we do see that there's a couple states now waking up. We've had enough of these governors.
Yeah.
We're going to get rid of a couple of them.
I wish we could do that here. But you know, you talk about the sports, and that is critical. You're right, it's easy to discount sports, and I would add high school band to that. But I looked through that scrolling, I looked through all of those suicides when I first looked at it, and there were quite a few of them who were high school sports stars, as you say, going into your most important senior year as a high school football star, and they say, forget it, too bad, or the band members and that sort of thing. But you know, I'm sad to say this, my old alma mater, UC Berkeley, Adam Dick at RPI wrote about this. They said you can't even go outside to exercise. You know, and these are people who, with some exceptions, of course, very few exceptions, virtually none of the young people going to this school are vulnerable to getting even sick, but certainly not to dying. There are a few, obviously, that should take care, and they're saying everyone completely locked down. You know, my own son is, as you know, is at A&M doing aerospace. It's virtual classes. And these are lab classes. These are lab-intensive classes where you need to be in a lab. No wonder the airplanes are going to start falling out of the sky even more because these kids are learning online. They're not actually touching things and making them work. So it's really unbelievable. And as you say, there is no real science behind this.
No, and this is epidemic. It includes a society. I think there's a social consequence to this because there's such a strong endorsement. Because individuals have been known to get this condition, germophobia, and it's very, very bad because they have a tough time recovering from it. And I've always been interested in at least trying to study and read and learn something about Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes was fascinating because he was brilliant.
Yeah.
He was a gambler in a sense that he took risks. He made a lot of money, but he had the condition of germophobia, and it got worse as he got older. And he became so meticulous he couldn't touch anything without scrubbing his hands. And as obsessed as he was with that, and as much effort he put into staying clean, they said he died in just filth.
Huh.
He was filthy dirty when he died, and it was just uncontrollable. And I keep thinking, can a society get germophobia? And you know, I think they can, you know, because it's for various reasons. A lot of people we meet and tell they feel so obligated. I don't want to offend this person. They're worried about it, and maybe she is sick, and maybe she's elderly and this, so I don't want to offend people, and they go along with that. So they're not always, you know, into this that believe like some. Now, I don't know about the people who promote this. I often think about that too. They promote it. Do they know what we know, that this is you know, all fake? And but that's a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
So you're not allowed to endorse that. But let's give them a pass for the discussion. They're not that kind. But why do they do it? And why do the people go along with it? And but it is information, false information. And I started off about talking about lies and distortions, and they're endless. And sometimes they're at a milder level. You know, to try to talk a country into going to a senseless, stupid war, works. And this war on this virus has worked. People have been willing to sacrifice their liberties because they've been frightened. And so it is sorting out the truth is the biggest problem and the job that we have. And it takes a lot of time. But the motivation behind it, I know a lot of people tell me, well, you're too willing to give them a pass. I really don't give them a pass because I have not such good feelings about some of them. But others, the one other victim that we haven't mentioned yet is what about the person that goes along because they're going to lose their livelihood? What about that poor woman, that single mother that was taking care of that 8-year-old, and but they closed the restaurant? But what if it was just her not wanting to wear a mask or something and standing up for it? That they have to worry about that because they lose it, and the mother of that child couldn't get, she didn't qualify for any aid at all. So this is just a horrendous thing because of this acceptance of lies. That is why governments, it's not an exception when governments lie. It's an exception when you can get the truth out of government. And I think it's a good rule that one of the reasons why if you get leery of such a system, that your argument ought to be for minimizing. And some argue get rid of a lot of the government because that is a tendency of human nature. Why are these local mayors and county commissioners and everybody down the ladder writing executive orders that are legislation? They have no authority to do it, and they're feeling their oats, and the people have tolerated it. I say that people don't need to tolerate this. If they have some ammunition, and if they have some ammunition in spite of all the shortcomings of the internet, if you want to know the truth about masks, you can find the truth and the fiction. Read both and make a decision and check out who's saying what, because the whole thing is to get people conditioned to go along with it and not question the authorities.
Yeah, well, we got a new mayor here in Lake Jackson, and he made a lot of good sounds on the campaign trail, but the policy hasn't changed. He still has his, quote, mask mandate of his predecessor in. And it is bad here. There's a lot of compliance. There's probably 95% compliance or more down here, and it is a shame. It's unfortunate. There are a lot of state worship down here, unfortunately, but there are some rebels. In fact, Dr. Paul, I ran into a very, very nice lady. I'm sure you'd know her, but she was going to HEB without a mask on, and she recognized me, and she said, oh, we knew each other from anti-mask protests that we were involved in down here. But I'm going to do one other invisible victim, if we can, and I think this is a lot more widespread than we think. This has happened to be from Wales, but it doesn't matter. This happens a lot. Domestic abuse victims may be stuck in lockdown with their abusers. And this is absolutely disgusting. And of course, it's much worse in the UK than it is here. As bad as we think it is here, the UK has gone completely bonkers on this stuff. But can you imagine, Dr. Paul, a young lady like this, or even, men, it can happen as well, who are in a situation where their spouse or their partner is abusing them, and they literally cannot physically get out of the house for their own protection. And that also, kids are also involved in that as well. Talk about the classic invisible victims, because nobody will know about it because they can't even tell anybody about it.
Right. We've heard this story about so many economic problems coming from this. And of course, there's an overriding issue of an economy that turns down that they don't talk about because they don't want to admit to it. But that is the business cycle created by the Federal Reserve, spending and borrowing, that sort of thing. But the lockdown has certainly added a lot of fuel to the fire, and it's the immediate thing on the table to deal with. So when there's a problem in this country, what happens is the politicians respond. They don't go toward doing the right thing, that is minimizing government interference, minimize the spending, quit printing the money. They do much more, spend more money. It's not billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars, it's trillions of dollars. This week, at this very moment, they're going to pass another $2 trillion, and that's going to save the day for everybody. But then you have to ask the question, is that all for free? No, it's not for free. Somebody has to pay. And guess who these invisible victims are? The poor and the middle class, because they end up with inflation, which is accelerating at this very moment because the money is losing value. The money doesn't create wealth at all, and they're suffering these consequences. So, but wouldn't that affect everybody equally? Oh yeah, Walmart, they've been really suffering, and Amazon, they've been really suffering. Yeah, they lost a couple billion here or there, but they still have their trillions. And so it is a consequence of all this stuff going on, all this pretense that they're going to help save us from the virus. It contributes to the maldistribution of wealth, just feeding the arguments by the far left and the Marxists to see what free markets do. I've even just recently I was accused of, well, you have it wrong, Ron. We were talking about the energy lockdown regarding the weather here.
Yeah.
Well, you can't say anybody in government had anything to do wrong with that, because here you were in Texas, you had the free enterprise system and you still had a problem. Well, no, you got to look at it a little more carefully than that. But the middle class gets wiped out on that. One other thing I want to mention along this line is the small businessman. I think we've heard enough about they got locked out and they've had a lot of trouble. But I tell you one thing: there's a small businessman that is really invisible, because you know that landlords are seen. You know, they maybe own a skyscraper in New York and they're making a lot of money, and rich people who own them and this sort of thing. So, but some of their tenants couldn't pay, so they had a moratorium. Government said, well, they don't have any money. We can't pass out any more, so there's a moratorium. You cannot, you cannot put pressure on a tenant because they don't have any money. So it's well intended, but it's the wrong thing to do, because I know of individuals, a lot of them, and I bet there's a lot of people listening to this program would say individuals that aren't with the other, they're middle class, and they might have a rent house or two, and they're barely making it, and they have bills to pay, have mortgage to pay, insurance to pay. So the government comes along and said, oh, moratorium, you don't have to pay. So if you can't even put pressure on them, say pay a little bit of your rent.
Yeah.
You know, you talk about looking for victims. The very people who are trying to get ahead, you know, they can get wiped out from that. The fact that if they have 2 or 3 rent houses or something and they don't get any payment, and they're on the side of the law.
Yeah.
So,
well, I've got to close out with something, and we always like to do facts, and we always like to put up charts, and this is a really fascinating chart, and it's put up by an Irish expert who's been following this and has done very great work, Ivor Cummins, and this is fascinating. This is a chart. I think he says this is the only chart that counts, and I think it is the only chart that counts. This is excess mortality in Europe 2020. So this will say how many more people died than the average of 2016, 2019 versus 2020 is the chart. And here's what Ivor says. Sweden, with no lockdown, and you can see that's the red, and no mask, achieved the status of being one of the best performers in Europe for minimizing excess mortality, the real metric, the crucial metric. So no matter the lies, deceit, and propaganda we have suffered, he writes, this is the last word. So take a look at that chart. Take a look at Sweden. It wasn't the absolute best performer, but look how it beat out so much more of the rest of Europe with no mask mandate, no lockdowns, no social distancing, and their attitude was take care of yourself. If you need to take some protection and precaution, you should do it, but we're not going to force you to do it. And they did pretty well.
You know, I was wondering when you're making this point, I wonder if there could be a conspiracy to keep this information from the general population. But that's no good. If you say conspiracy. Oh, you're in trouble. So nobody's allowed to even hear about this because they might believe this conspiracy, but they might believe the truth, and that's the big thing. Now I want to go ahead and close out because this is a very important issue, and we approach this a little bit differently than we have in the past because we deal with the direct consequence of what people are doing. And this is sort of the people that you never hear too much about. And starting off with that little girl that was starving, and it was a consequence of the lockdown and the way that has been handled. And I think there's a couple characteristics that develop under these conditions that make it worse, and that is the people become dependent. But they became dependent even before the virus came. Dependency comes when government offers to take care of them. And in a society, whether it's an interventionist, pseudo-free enterprise system, or a Keynesian system or a socialist system, the government wants people to be dependent. And they offer it, they embellish, and they threaten you if you don't do it, you're not going to be well off. And you're not going to have a job and you're not going to have food. So they scare them into it. So dependency becomes epidemic, and there's more of that than ever before, but more people have to ask questions. And also, it's the whole thing that goes along with dependency is just flat out apathy. I don't have the energy to worry about this. I just will have to do my best. I'll tell you what, things won't get better if we're apathetic and we accept the fact that we are dependent on the government and the government is going to take care of us. That has nothing to do with liberty. That has to do with how people extinguish liberty. And that is what we're in a crisis in this country. It's been going on systematically. Matter of fact, there were some at the time of the founding of this country that warned us. This is not a perfect system. The Constitution is not perfect. It's going to be eroded unless we have a moral society where the people are willing to take care of and help other people. And that only moral people end up in government. But it isn't that way. The more immoral a person is, the more likely is they'll be motivated to get into government. And Hayek says the worst rises to the top. They rise to the top, and then they're in charge, and we have a lot of that now. We have bureaucrat political management of a lot of people who don't think about liberty as much as they should, and as much as we'd like to get people to think about it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.